My name is Al Tillery, and I am the director of the Center for the Study of Diversity and Democracy at Northwestern University. I want to welcome you today to the center's Business Forum webinar on managing collective trauma in workplace settings. The Business Forum is a membership organization that provides partnership and learning opportunities for leading corporations. We're grateful to our current partners, 2U, Groupon, McDonald's, Meta, Nike, Newfront Insurance, and PPG for their generous support of the program, and Northwestern's Office of Corporate Engagement for their stewardship of these critical relationships. Today, we're really fortunate to have two of the world's leading experts on trauma present to us. I could easily take up all of the time allotted for this webinar simply by reading their list of accomplishments, but as we're doing a power hour here, I'll be just presenting some of the highlights of their biographies. So I'm going to ask Dr. Burnett-Zeigler and Dr. Cohen Silver to unmute and turn their video on, and I'll read their introductions, and then we'll get started. So Dr. Inger Burnett-Zeigler is Associate Professor of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the Northwestern University Feinberg School of Medicine. She's also an alum of Northwestern, having received her PhD from the Feinberg School in 2009. Her clinical interests are in mood and anxiety disorders, comorbid substance use disorders, stress management, wellness, and interpersonal relationships. She is the author of dozens of academic papers and celebrated book, Nobody Knows the Trouble I've Seen, Exploring the Emotional Lives of Black Women, which was published by Amistad in 2021. Dr. Roxane Cohen Silver is Vice Provost for Academic Planning and Institutional Research and Distinguished Professor of Psychological Science at the University of California, Irvine. She too is a Wildcat. I'm happy to brag about my two illustrious colleagues, both having Northwestern degrees. Roxane earned both her PhD and undergraduate degrees from Northwestern. She has published more than 100 academic papers in her career and is the author or editor of 3 books. Her most recent book, The Foundations of Health Psychology, was named an outstanding academic title by Choice Magazine for the 2007-2008 year. And so I am just thrilled to be able to be in conversation with these two amazing scholars. We are going to have Dr. Burnett-Zeigler present to us first. And then we will have Dr. Cohen Silver come on. So I'm going to mute and let Dr. Burnett-Zeigler start her presentation.
Thank you, Professor Tillery, for the introduction and for the invitation to be a part of this discussion today. In my time today, I'll be speaking about the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and racial injustice on mental health over the last couple of years. To be sure, the last 2 years have been hard. Coping with the COVID-19 pandemic, the widely televised police killings of Black people, civil unrest, Asian hate crimes, the US Capitol insurrection, highly televised high-profile sexual assault cases, immigration, the Israeli-Palestine conflict, and abortion legislation, to name a few. And these social circumstances have led people's lives to be significantly impacted. COVID-19 in particular caused people's routines to be significantly disrupted, leading to changes in work demands. People experienced significant separation and loss from their loved ones. Many people, not only due to COVID, but also due to civil unrest and racial injustice, felt a fear for their safety and overall well-being. People were isolated and unable to connect to their supports in the ways in which they were accustomed. And there was uncertainty about the future. And all of these events led to significant mental health challenges. In general, when we think about stress, there are a number of things that can cause stress in one's life, and the American Psychological Association has identified these top 10 stressors among Americans to include money, work, the economy, relationships, personal health, housing costs, job stability, family health, and personal safety. And when we think about the last 2 years in COVID, as well as in racial injustice, several of these factors have been particularly exacerbated, namely money, work, and the economy, where increased stressors among people, as well as coping with health and personal safety. We know that in the Black community, individuals experience the stressors that I just named, as well as additional stressors. And these additional stressors include things like employment and employment stability, poverty, racism and discrimination, daily hassles, and trauma. These additional stresses are experienced in general in the Black community and have been particularly exacerbated in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the racial injustice. Additionally, when we think about stress in the Black community, there's the added burden of provider and caregiver stress. And again, this provider and caregiver stress already existed prior to COVID-19 and has been heightened in light of COVID-19. The data tells us that college educated Black women earn less than those who are white. More Black women live in poverty than those who are white. 9% of Black women are unemployed. Black women take on a disproportionate responsibility of caring for their children and are largely responsible for being the earners in their household or the heads of their households. And these disparities in terms of earnings, income, living in poverty, as well as head of household and caregiver responsibilities leads to increased stress among Black women in particular. Additionally, we know that trauma experiences are more prevalent in the Black community, with about 8 in 10 of Black women in particular having experienced a traumatic event in their lifetime. When we think about trauma, we can consider it as in terms of a broad spectrum of trauma, including things like sexual, physical, and emotional abuse, neglect, traumatic grief or separation that can include things like death, divorce, or a parent being incarcerated, intimate partner violence, community violence, natural disaster, war, terrorism, or serious accident or illness. And I'd like to put an asterisk next to serious accident or illness because that certainly can include traumatic responses that people have had due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Additionally, we know that Black children are more likely to experience child maltreatment, physical and sexual abuse. Black adults have the highest number of cumulative traumatic events over the course of their lifetime. So not just experiencing one traumatic event, but these traumatic events often building on top of each other. For example, one might experience childhood trauma, go on to be in a relationship in which there is intimate partner violence, and also experience community violence related to neighborhood chaos or gun violence in their neighborhoods. We know that individuals in the Black community have higher rates of PTSD, with an estimated 14% experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder at some point in their lifetime. Additionally, thinking about other forms of traumatic stress that are disproportionately prevalent in the Black community, thinking about intimate partner violence. Intimate partner violence impacts about 12 million people per year, and about a third of women experience physical violence by an intimate partner in their lifetime. About 40% as compared to 30% of Black women experience intimate partner violence. And a point in which individuals are at particularly high risk for homicide as related to intimate partner violence is at the point of separation from the individual with whom they have been in relationship with. I highlight a few young women who were unfortunately lost their lives prematurely due to intimate partner violence. And the top is Naila Franklin, a Chicagoan. On the bottom is Dr. Tamara O'Neill. And on the bottom right is Aisha Frazier. All of these individuals were well loved, engaged with their friends and family, successful in their careers, and unexpectedly, as reported by their family members, in these dangerous relationships. And I highlight these individuals because I believe that too often the risk factors, particularly for Black women in intimate partner violence relationships, goes unnoticed. And when these women lost their lives in an untimely way, many of their family members said that they didn't know that the circumstances were that grave. So, really, just highlighting the importance of recognizing that intimate partner violence disproportionately affects Black women and can affect Black women and women in general across the socioeconomic spectrum. Continuing the conversation about trauma, I want to highlight racial trauma and race based traumatic stress. Define racial trauma being a mental or emotional injury that's caused by racial bias and ethnic discrimination, racism, and hate crimes. That's more likely to be experienced by Black and Indigenous people of color. Some examples of events that can lead to racial trauma or race based traumatic stress include directly confronting a racist event, being a target of racism or discrimination. Additionally, exposure to vicarious racism or secondhand racism, which has been particularly relevant over the last 2 years, where we've seen images again of Black people being killed by police over television and other violent instances being repeatedly shown, not only on television, but also through social media and even in conversation. And it's important to highlight that while these vicarious exposures to racism can be triggering in and of themselves, they are especially triggering for individuals who have a previous history of encountering traumatic events. Additionally, microaggressions, defined as kind of these intended or unintended slights or insults that individuals might experience based on aspects of their identity, including race, gender, sexuality, or others. Chronic contextual stress contributing to racial trauma or race based traumatic stress, whereby individuals are in a context, be it a workplace or in their neighborhood or some other setting, where they're repeatedly exposed to stress related to racism or discrimination. Collective experiences of racism, including the racism that one may not experience directly, but is nonetheless felt as being a part of a culture or a group that is persistently the target of racism or discrimination. And finally, transgenerational transmission of group trauma, whereby the impacts of trauma are passed on either through biological imprint, through the emotional residue that is felt by, for example, a mother who has experienced trauma and that trauma impacting the ways in which they engage with their child, or by the behavioral residue of one who has experienced trauma, whereby their behaviors impact those that are in constant and frequent relationship with them. We know that stress and trauma are associated with one's emotional health, being connected to experiences of depression, anxiety, post traumatic stress disorder, as I've already mentioned. physical health. We know that people who have greater experiences with stress and trauma are more likely to have negative health outcomes, including being at a higher risk for obesity, higher risk for cardiovascular disease, higher risk for poor maternal health outcomes. Behavioral challenges indicated by one's fear and worry, leading to isolation, lack of trust, and difficulty engaging with individuals around them. These behavioral changes having a potentially detrimental impact on one's relationships, where that trust can really interfere with one being able to engage in healthy relationships and use the supports around them. This can show up in work productivity, where experiences of stress and trauma are distracting, whereby individuals are unable to attend to, in the same way, their work activities, whereby they're constantly distracted by the thoughts of the stress and trauma that are taking over the contents of their mind. Also contributing to imposter syndrome, where people have a sense of not belonging and not good enough. And this imposter syndrome is particularly prevalent among women and people of color. And not only women and people of color, but also individuals who are high performing and tend to be the most productive, believing that they're being judged or negatively viewed by their colleagues. Stereotype threat, whereby individuals are concerned that they will be negatively viewed in the same way that others of their racial group or culture, leading to a hypervigilance around behaviors in the workspace in particular, as well as other environments. And this constant uh, um, this constant assessing of their behaviors and their thoughts, really interfering with being able to be as engaged and productive as they might otherwise be. All of these factors contributing to low life satisfaction, as well as poor job satisfaction, and further loneliness, isolation, and a sense of not belonging. And so, taking all of this into consideration, not only the stress and trauma that's come from COVID, from racial injustice of the last 2 years, but has existed particularly in communities of color prior to the COVID-19 pandemic and been exacerbated over the last 2 years. A couple of strategies to keep in mind, starting with just paying attention to what's showing up, paying attention to what's showing up in the mind, in the body, and in the behavior. Recognizing that for the last 2 years, so many of us have been working on autopilot, just doing what we can to keep going, but paying attention and recognizing the ways that stress and trauma are showing up in our lives is the first step towards implementing positive behavioral strategies. Taking time to prioritize the self and care for the self in the midst of all of the busyness that persists. Maintaining a routine, which the first step towards is establishing boundaries or creating space in order to care for the self. Paying attention to your thoughts, and particularly when it comes to stress and trauma, one might notice that the thoughts are full of things to do, fear-based thoughts, worry-based thoughts, concern about something bad happening coming forward. Noticing these thoughts and considering alternatives where you can. Practicing self-compassion, talking to yourself in the same way that you might talk to a friend or a loved one. As a clinician, I have noticed that in the COVID-19 pandemic, people have been really hard on themselves and put that same pressure on themselves to function as they might have prior to the pandemic. This is an opportunity to really embrace that we are in a new normal and to practice giving ourselves and our loved ones a little bit of grace. Recognizing the supports that we have around us and leaning into them. Not only attending to the stress that's in our lives, but also intentionally finding opportunities for joy. And not just the big moments of joy, but those little moments of joy that might come from this 70-degree day that we're having in Chicago, being in nature, or just an opportunity to have a pleasant conversation with someone. And finally, taking time to rest and breathe. As a mindfulness practitioner, I always invite people to come back to their breath. Our breath can often tell us when we are upset, when we're stressed, when we're anxious, and using our breath to regulate how we're feeling in the moment and as an anchor to the present moment, with the present moment being the only moment that we have control over. Thank you for your time, and I'll pause my presentation here.
Okay, thank you so much, Inger, for that great presentation. We're now going to bring Roxane on and hear from her. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm assuming I can be heard right now. I'd like to thank the Center for the Study of Diversity and Democracy Business Forum for inviting me to present today. And I would particularly like to thank Dr. Tillery and Dr. Burnett-Zeigler for doing a wonderful job presenting the context of what I'm going to be talking about today. And you will see a great deal of compatibility between what you just heard and what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to be speaking about whether we have survived the trauma of COVID-19, and I'm going to spend a few minutes looking backward and then looking forward. I am a stress and coping researcher. I'm a social psychologist, and I have been studying collective traumas for about 30 to 40 years. And I would like to define what I mean by collective trauma as an event that is random, unpredictable, uncontrollable. And the reason why it is a collective trauma is because it's a shared experience among many individuals. And what is so striking about collective traumas is that local events can rapidly become national and international ones due to media transmission. So let's enter 2020. In the middle of 2020, and in fact, begun the day after the George Floyd murder, my colleagues and I started to draft a commentary that was ultimately published at the end of 2020 in Nature Human Behavior, in which we talked about how the United States has been coping with cascading collective traumas. And I'll just share with you a comment at the beginning of our article. The year 2020 has been marked by unprecedented cascading traumas, including the COVID-19 pandemic, an economic recession, race-driven social unrest, and weather-related disasters. Mental health consequences of direct and media-based exposure to compounding stressors may be profound. Now, that is at the end of 2020, before the insurrection, before the recent events that were so nicely articulated by Dr. Burnett-Zeigler. And I would like to say that, as you'll see throughout my presentation, that 2020, of course, continued into 2021 and now into 2022. COVID-19 is a unique collective stressor, a unique collective trauma. And there are several reasons for this. It has been an invisible threat. We do not know who is infected. It is an ambiguous threat. Even today, we still do not know how bad this will get. Of course, we are optimistic, But at any point during the pandemic, I think it has been extremely ambiguous how bad things would get. It has been a slow-moving disaster that has altered our sense of time. We have had an uncertain future. We really do not know how long this will last. And this has been a global threat. No community has been safe, even the smallest islands in the middle of the Pacific. In addition, we have been encouraged to respond to COVID-19 with behavioral modifications, and the imperative to socially distance has conflicted with our natural desire to connect with family and friends during stressful times. Also, our typical sources of distraction, such as professional or personal sports, going to the gym, restaurants and bars, movies, travel, have been restricted on and off throughout the pandemic. And this disruption has occurred in all aspects of life, in our social lives, in our work lives, and in the ways in which we have worshiped. In 2020, within 5 days of the US declaration of COVID-19 as an emergency, my colleagues and I began a nationally representative study of the COVID pandemic on 6,500 Americans. And I will just share with you a little bit about this study and share with you some results over the next few minutes that we have obtained from our project. One of the things we did is we rolled out our study slowly in 10-day periods of time, in which about 2,100 to 2,300 people completed surveys at the very beginning of March, then March into April, and then in April 2020. And as you can see in this slide, we went from 190 deaths in the United States in the first days to over 18,000 deaths in the United States in those first 30 days. The first report from our project was published in Science Advances describing this unfolding COVID-19 pandemic. And we had particularly sought to understand predictors of distress as the pandemic worsened over time. Now, first, let me say that over those first 30 days, there was a significant increase nationally in acute stress and how we responded psychologically and emotionally to the disaster that was unfolding in front of us. In addition, there were increased rates of depression, significantly increasing nationally across 30 days. But very importantly, and what I would like to focus on, is the important role of the media in exacerbating that distress. On this slide, on the horizontal, we see the daily hours of COVID-19 related media to which people were exposed. This is a combined index of people's exposure via television, via social media, via radio, via online news sources. And as you can see, as the number of hours of daily media exposure increased in our sample, there was a corresponding increase in the amount of acute stress that people reported. In addition, and very importantly, there was something particular about receiving conflicting information from the news media, such that the more people were exposed to conflicting messages in the media about COVID-19, the more likely they were to exhibit acute stress. And what I can say is that this conflicting information only increased certainly over the first year of the pandemic, and certainly after the first 30 days of the pandemic, which is this particular snapshot. So to summarize our early research on COVID-19, I'd like to highlight how the media is a double-edged sword. People seek trusted information via the media, and that has happened throughout the pandemic. but rumors and misinformation appear in both social and traditional media. And overexposure to news media can amplify distress with downstream health effects, as my colleagues and I articulated in a paper in 2020, where we reviewed the literature on this topic and showed how this distress over time can lead to physical health consequences. In addition, conflicting political agendas and contradictory messages in the news media are especially stressful. So I have a few recommendations regarding the media. First, and I have said this to many journalists and many media sources, most of whom understand and agree, but nonetheless, this competes with the challenges of trying to gain readership or gain eyeballs. But the media, from our research, should convey information to the extent to which it can without sensationalism and or disturbing images. And importantly, the public should be wary of unverified reports on social media. And in addition, the public should limit repetitious exposure to media stories and should select authoritative outlets and monitor the amount of exposure. Journalists have called the tendency to just click on one link to another link to another link of bad news as doom scrolling. And my colleagues and I strongly recommend that people limit their repetitious exposure to all bad news all the time. After the first wave of data collection, which was in the very early stage of the COVID-19 pandemic, we have thus far collected 2 additional waves of data collection, one about 6 months later and one about a year after that. And our most recent data collection ended in November 2021. We will soon, hopefully in the next week, launch our 4th wave of data collection on this study. We have continued to analyze these data. There's an enormous amount of data available to us. I'm just going to take a few minutes to show a few more snapshots of our findings. One of the things that we've been interested in doing is examining the mental health impact of differing exposures. What is the psychological impact of community restrictions or personal exposures or statewide differences in rates of illness, hospitalization, and deaths? And I would say, surprisingly, we have found that the state level case numbers, the state level deaths, the state level restrictions, which are represented by the first 3 groups of bars to the left, had very little impact on our levels of distress, represented by the blue bar, loneliness, represented by the orange bars, or traumatic stress, as represented by the green bars. Indeed, what seems to be the strongest predictors of mental health outcomes during the last year and a half is personal case numbers. How many people you know who've gotten sick, how many people you know who have died, whether or not one got sick themselves to COVID, and the far right, how much media people are exposed to about COVID-19. Looking forward, I think it is important to acknowledge that uncertainty is stressful, anxiety is appropriate under the circumstances. I also noticed the comment that Dr. Burnett-Zeigler used, which I also use, which is that this is a normal reaction to the new normal. This has been a very difficult 2 years, and many people are emotionally exhausted. And the crises have cascaded continuously. We're now dealing with inflation of a very dramatic sort. The Ukraine invasion images are we're being bombarded by graphic, gruesome, terrible images of the conflict in Ukraine. We have increasing numbers of climate-related disasters. And all of these crises are being experienced in the context of the pandemic. And this is particularly taxing. In 2020, I was asked to write a commentary in Science on surviving the trauma of COVID-19. And one of the things I said in my commentary was that in the context of this horrible set of tragedies, people are nonetheless likely to experience some positive outcomes that they might find helpful if they recognized and continued to bring forward in their minds. And in our project, we did ask people about whether or not they experienced anything positive as a result of the pandemic. And what you can see, first, the yellow bar is increased gratitude. 80% of our sample reported feeling increased gratitude, but the green bar represents how people reflected and readjusted their life's priorities. The brown bar, people recognized new strengths and skills. Blue bar felt a greater sense of community. The red bar, more time for leisure activities. And the far right purplish blue bar, how people reprioritized important relationships in their lives. What you can see then is that even in the context of the tragedy, people are able to see something positive about this horrible time that we've been through. We also asked people to write a little bit about what they saw as the sort of positive outcomes or positive things that they're holding on to in the context of the pandemic, and note time, family, home life were important, open-ended kinds of things that people brought forward. So to conclude, lessons learned from the research on collective traumas to get us through 2022 and beyond. People are likely to cope with this situation in many different ways. And I think it's very important to recognize that we should expect variability in response due to the variability in exposures, differential resources, etc. The media play a very important role in our mental health responses. While not minimizing the distress we may feel now, research across the last many decades has shown how people are quite resilient, even in the context of traumatic, prolonged stress. And I think that we will get through this eventually, recognizing the strengths and coping skills we never realized we had. Thank you, and I would like to acknowledge the National Science Foundation for its funding of this research and my colleagues. Thanks again.
Thank you so much, Roxane. That was really great. I'm going to ask Inger to come back on, and let's start the conversation phase of the webinar. I learned so much from what both of you just shared with us. Thank you. I mean, it's just really, really amazing research. And what I want to do now, because I know that our members always want to know, is how do we translate some of what you've taught us into action items for their corporations, for their organizations? And so I'm going to ask each of you a question or two about that. I also want to say to the folks who are joining us in the audience, this is the time for you now to drop your questions in the Q&A chat, and we will come to those momentarily as well. But I'd like to start with you, Roxane. You talked about sort of the ways in which sort of family circumstances are really the kind of lens through which people are experiencing the pandemic. What should corporations do with that knowledge that you've just shared? I mean, I work as a consultant, and a lot of organizations are experimenting with ways to have conversations with their workers about what they're experiencing, ways to report to the community when someone has experienced a loss, so what's the best practice for a corporation for sort of getting into the really heavy issues that people are experiencing at a family level?
Yes, well, I would say that flexibility is an extremely important feature of the current time that we find ourselves in. And that's very, very challenging for a corporation or for an academic institution like my own to still go forward and do what we need to do for our work, for the expectations for me as an academic to teach my students, despite the fact that they may be contending with illness for themselves or in their family. Flexibility, however, I think is really important, recognizing that both employees, students, our colleagues, our peers are human beings first and are dealing with and contending with many, many challenges. What we know, as Dr. Burnett-Zeigler made very clear, is that certain groups of people, particularly underrepresented minorities, had different levels of exposure to the stress of the last several years. So that is one very important issue that I think must be acknowledged. In addition, I think that it is important to recognize that some people have more resources than others, better internet than others. And I think that the challenges really do require acknowledging that people are coping with some very difficult experiences. I was in a meeting yesterday at the university in which somebody asked about the strain for the students during this pandemic period. And I almost wanted to sort of yell out, and it's the faculty and the staff and the parents of the students who are also dealing with these strains. I think it's very easy to focus on one group without recognizing that, as I said, this has been a very, very difficult time, and it's not stopping. It's not we see it, while it may be the pandemic may be winding down, but in addition, we see increased climate-related disasters. I mean, I heard that it's warm in Chicago right now, but I know it was very cold when the Cubs played a couple of days ago. So, there's rapid climate fluctuations. We're dealing with climate-related disasters, and we're dealing with the war in Ukraine. And so I think it's really important to recognize that this reality will be with us for some time. I think in addition to being flexible, it is important that we recognize that people at the top should be encouraging self-care and should be encouraging an acknowledgement that people may need to take a mental health day or some time off during the day or during the month.
That's crucial. I want just a quick follow, because I also heard you talking about the wash in sort of bad information, right? And so a lot of corporate leaders that I've worked with, they tried really hard through the pandemic to present little snippets of good information about how people can protect themselves and why they were taking certain steps with vaccines. Is that something that you would also encourage corporate leaders to do?
Absolutely. I think my university right now, the University of California, Irvine, sends out a daily digest with little tips, with authoritative research, peer-reviewed research, not pre-peer-reviewed research, but peer-reviewed research that is appearing in authoritative journals that help guide our behavior and our decision-making.
Right. So Inger, we've got a question from Millette Granville, who's the CDO for our corporate partner 2U, and is really the impetus for us putting on this webinar. It was really, she was the driving force behind it. And her question kind of dovetails with mine, so I'm going to splice them together a little bit. You listed a bunch of really fantastic interventions that we could do on a personal level to manage our stress and trauma at the end of your presentation. How does that translate, in your view, to sort of the support systems that corporations can put in place for all of their workers, but in particular for, BIPOC workers? Like how can we make that translation from, knowing that I should breathe to kind of like wellness programs that corporations can put in place? And what are some things you might recommend? Because all of our partners want to do better for their teams. Right?
Sure. Thank you for that question. To start, I think it's important to remind ourselves that people are bringing their whole selves to the workplace. And as Professor Silver mentioned, that, although we know that communities of color have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic and racial injustice and civil unrest, we must also remind ourselves that these stressors and these traumas are placed upon stressors and traumas that were already present in these communities. Secondly, when talking about self-care and promoting self-care, I think it's also important for corporate leaders and leaders in a variety of spaces to be able to model that to their teams and their employees. So often I see that, people are, encouraging people to practice self-care, practice the various methods that I've outlined, but those words are sometimes misaligned with their behaviors. They're still getting emails at all hours of the night. They're still kind of experiencing a heightened work demand that's misaligned with this idea of better managing their self-care. One specific way that leaders can do that is by creating space for their teams to acknowledge the stressors that they're experiencing right in the moment. And that's something that I've put into place even with my team that, requires a little bit more disclosure, which can sometimes be uncomfortable, but it really creates an inviting space and it allows team members to show their own individual humanity for the individuals that they're working with, as well as do a warm handoff to particular resources that their organization might offer. And then finally, another concrete method that I might suggest is I know that some corporations are practicing blackout times, and those are really times where it's from the top down, where emails aren't being sent, expectations aren't being asked of their employees. And I know that for some that can be a challenge, but it's really kind of creating this culture that's setting the stage of really demonstrating the belief in this importance of pausing, if nothing else, just pausing, slowing down, taking stock of where everyone in the organization is mentally, emotionally, behaviorally, and creating a build-in of that opportunity to be practicing some methods for better wellness in these difficult times.
It's really great advice. I want to go back to something that Roxane, you said about the doom scrolling, right? So, corporate leaders are kind of in a tug of war now, because of the ESG framework. You referenced Ukraine. Everyone wants to do the right thing by, kind of marginalized communities that are under threat. And so does that leave corporate leaders kind of in a balance between people who want to talk about and acknowledge the traumas in the moment and people who aren't necessarily prepared to engage? And so how do you navigate that tension if you're a corporate leader that wants to say, have a policy that's just for people of color or isn't furthering more environmental harm? Or how do you curate the conversations in a way that are meaningful, are going to achieve company objectives, but not further traumatize the people that you're worried about?
I mean, it's a very difficult question. Let me also add in people who are immunocompromised or who have young children, people who cannot get vaccinated. That is one group of individuals who may still feel that we're in the midst of the pandemic. But in terms of sort of making policy, I think that many corporate environments that I'm aware of do expect that people are working during their work time and not spending time reading hours of terrible news about Ukraine or climate change or inflation or the economy. So I think it's important to recommend that people recognize and monitor their media content and their media exposure. And I think that the sort of little tips about how to take care of oneself could be interspersed with other messages that are coming out. I'm not sure, and I'm curious what Dr. Burnett-Zeigler feels about specific policies for specific groups of people. I don't think I would recommend that, but I would recommend flexibility and acknowledgement that some people are dealing with, let's say somebody is a refugee themselves. They may be particularly stressed by the issues of Ukraine, or if they're from an immigrant family, or if they have served in the military, or if they have a loved one who's in the military. Those people may be particularly stressed by what's going on in the Ukraine conflict. So again, I'm not sure I would single out particular groups, because everybody has a reason in which, as Dr. Burnett-Zeigler made very clear, there have been so many different things that could have triggered us, both in the past and in the present, that I think that it probably is important just to encourage the positive activities, discourage unhelpful, likely damaging activities, and encourage self-care again.
Yeah, I mean, that really leads us to another question from Yemi Akisanya, who's a lead CDO leader, who's a member of our, our membership. And Inger, how do you have conversations about what you are really expert in, which is understanding the particular life experiences of African Americans, and how these traumas, are really heightened for them for a variety of reasons. The question is, how do you educate and provide leaders with the competencies to have these crucial conversations and enable a culture where everyone can feel like, they belong, and that these sort of addressing these problems for the particular target community is really everyone's responsibility in the organization. How do you boost that capacity to get leaders to a place where they can occasionally make choices about, say, we're going to focus on helping our Black population, or addressing Ukraine, because the reality is these are the kinds of questions that our corporate leaders are facing. Neutrality is not necessarily an option anymore for them. So how do you boost the competency of the leaders so that they can work in the way that they need to work to support these populations?
Sure. As a part of my consulting work, I have noticed that corporate leaders are making these conversations a priority by bringing in experts to highlight a number of things, to highlight, what does trauma look like? What are particular events that can lead to traumatic stress, like the things that have been discussed in our conversations today? How might that show up in employees, and what are the resources that we can offer to them? So some of those didactic conversations that not only provide the leaders themselves with necessary skills to be able to recognize employees that might be having a difficult time, but to provide them support. But also some of these conversations inviting the employees themselves to have conversation as a group, creating this safe space. And in that conversation, in that conversation, employees often just appreciate the acknowledgement of the distress that they've been experiencing over the last 2 years. And it sends a message through the organization and through the leadership that we recognize that this is something that is deeply impacting your individual lives, the way that you're showing up, and your family. And here, let's take out an hour or two to learn and to support each other and create space for that. And so I think that that's one thing that leaders can do. Similar conversations have been around developing allyship, creating a culture of belonging in the workplace, giving leaders and other colleagues the tools to be allies for colleagues who might be disproportionately experiencing stress and trauma right now, and also implementing various strategies in the workplace itself, in the workplace dynamic, whereby people can become more attuned to some of the strategies, some of the factors that can lead some individuals to feel more isolated and misunderstood, particularly as they're coping with these difficult times.
No, that's really, I agree with you 100%. I mean, I think the employee resource groups and networks are really sites where they can be a bridge, to some of these important conversations, and also spaces where the kind of, checking on one another at the team level that Roxane is suggesting is so essential. I think that ERGs had historically been these spaces for celebration, right, of cultural differences, accentuating the value that different cultures are bringing to organizations, and they can still do that work. And I noted, Inger, that sort of taking opportunities for joy is part of the way to manage trauma. So they can still do that, but I think that they're going to be called upon to really ramp up and be these sites of not just safety, but comfort, because Roxane's right. The pandemic is not over. It is not, going to be over even when we get to this new normal, whatever that is. And we're going to need tools that are going to make us resilient and give us the ability to support each other. So I have just been so honored to share the screen with you, colleagues, today. Any last words? We've got 2 minutes before the webinar closes.
I'll just say one final thing. Note that in our national study, 80% of people were able to focus on gratitude toward someone or something. And I think that that is something that corporate leaders can also make clear. If you're a workplace in which people's distress or stress is acknowledged, you can be very thankful that you're in such an environment that provides that recognition of the stress of the last several years, and acknowledge going forward that we'll take care of one another.
And I'll just end by underscoring one of the strategies that I closed with is just being kind to ourselves and knowing that we're still continuing to cope and taking it easy on ourselves and on our loved ones.
Yeah. And I want to thank you too for enlightening us. And I want to thank our corporate partners for being part of this conversation. Yeah, I wish you all well.